It's an honor to be in front of this record crowd to hear about auditing. It was like you made a mistake. I'm going to try to keep you awake as best I can. I was looking around before I walked up here to see a ton of friendly faces and faces that I've known for a long time. See some new faces too. So for those of you who I don't know well, my name's Shad. I'm the State Auditor of Mississippi. Tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in a town of 700 people in rural South Mississippi, and I'll tell you the story quickly too. So growing up, my dad was an oil field pumper. My mom was a public school teacher, and at least one night a week, my dad would come in, and he would take his boots off, and he would go to the bathroom, he would wash the dirt and the oil off of his face and out of his hair from the oil field, and he would eat dinner very, very quickly, and then he would leave one night a week to go across the street over to City Hall. And the reason he did that is for most of my life, he served as an elected official in our little town. He served as an alderman. And I sort of thought growing up that everybody's mom or dad did something like that. It was only later that I realized that, no, this is just a thing that Dad does. And he told me years later, he said, the reason I did that was to make my community better, but I also wanted to send a message to you that service to your community is important. Service to your town, your folks, the folks who are around you, that's important. And so I took that message very seriously, and now I get the honor of serving you every day as State Auditor. So that's why I love doing this job, because this lets me serve my state and my community. My dad's actually still an elected official. He still pumps oil every day. He's now the mayor of the little town I grew up in. He believes he is President of the United States. He drives a beat-up F-150 he calls Air Force One. We don't know what to do with him anymore, but he did this, and the message stuck with me, and so that's what makes me grateful to be able to be your State Auditor every single day. I'll tell you this, being auditor is not always easy. It's not always the easiest job in the world. So some of y'all have already read the book. Probably most of you know about the most famous case that we've had in my time as auditor, the big welfare scandal. And I'll tell you the story from sort of the beginning of that scandal. We investigated the missing welfare money for several months back in late 2019, and then in early 2020, we took our findings over to local DA and turned our findings over to the FBI, and the local DA decided to prosecute 6 people at the beginning of that case. That effectively cut off the flow of illegal welfare money flowing out the door. That indictment came down in the middle of the week, and then my agents, they will go out and arrest the individuals that are indicted. So we went out and we arrested 6 folks. And at the end of that week, the week goes by, and then my wife and I go to church on that Sunday. And at the time, we only had our oldest daughter. We have 3 kids now, but we had our oldest daughter at the time. So we go to church, and the church service is ending, and you know how at the end of the church service, the organs play, and people are wrapping up, and I was picking up my daughter's bottle and the stuffed goat and all the other little things that you have. And this woman who was in the pew in front of me turned around and looked at me, and she said, "You're Shad White." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "You're the State Auditor." And I said, "Uh-oh." And she said, you're the one that arrested those people this week. And I said, "Well, my agents from my office arrested several individuals this week, in a welfare case that we've been investigating." And she said, "Well, I know some of those people, and you're wrong." And she walked off. And I thought, happy Sunday to you too. I tell you that story because this job is not always easy, but the job entails me telling the truth about what happened to your money, regardless of whether it makes this one individual mad. And I think that the other folks in the auditor's office have bought into that idea, and that's why over the last 6 years we've been able to recover more of your money than any other 6-year period in the history of the auditor's office. That's why we've been able to do that, because everyone in the office has bought into that very simple vision. Do your job, tell the truth, and don't worry about the political consequences. And I'll say this, going through stuff like that, little instances like that happened to me multiple times through the course of that case. Going through that, I think made me much more battle-hardened, and that's a good thing in the long run. And it forced me to ask this question of myself: what would our state be like if we had elected officials who didn't worry about whether or not they were making this one person mad or that one person mad, and instead just worried about whether they were doing a good job for the larger body of taxpayers? What if we had elected officials who didn't worry about keeping powerful people happy? Didn't worry about being buddies with celebrities? Or celebrity quarterbacks, if I can say that? What if you had elected officials who did not care about that? Who just cared about doing their jobs? Who cared about looking out for people who go to work, pay their taxes, shop at Walmart, raise their kids, go to church, do what they're supposed to do every single day? What would the world look like? What would our state look like if we had elected officials like that? What policies would we have in place if we had elected officials like that? So what I wanted to do today is to try to answer that question for you. What sort of policies should we have as a state if our elected officials were looking out for us, for the taxpayers, for voting citizens of Mississippi? And for me, that question always starts with waste, government waste. Whenever we've uncovered government waste in the auditor's office, I tend to always find that somebody powerful is benefiting, or the waste exists because nobody's willing to stand up and call it out. Because they're afraid of a journalist writing a story about them or being called a mean name or whatever it is. I'll give you an example. We started an audit a few years ago. We audit Medicaid every single year. So Medicaid, as y'all know, is the big health care program for poor people in Mississippi. And several years ago, when President Trump was in office, he told every state auditor in the country, you need to do more to make sure that people who are on Medicaid are actually eligible to be on Medicaid. So here's what we did. We decided we would take the amount of money that a person said they made when they applied to be on Medicaid, and we would compare it to the amount of money that they said they made when they filed their state income tax return. Because, of course, nobody would be dumb enough to tell Medicaid, I only made $3,000 last year when they applied to be on Medicaid, but then put on their state income tax return that they made $300,000 last year, right? Nobody would be dumb enough to do that. You can see where this is going. Every year, in a given year, between 5 and 7% of people are doing just that. They look like they're making too much money to be eligible to be on Medicaid in the first place. And you may say, well, 5 to 7%, Shad, that's not that much. That's anywhere between $60 and $144 million per year, because Medicaid is a massive program of your money going down the drain. So let me back up a little bit. When we started talking about doing this audit in my office, I had a staffer who came up to me, and she'd been in the auditor's office for over 20 years, and she said, Shad, we cannot do this audit. We cannot do it. And I said, go on, tell me what your concern is. And she said, well, number one, this is going to be very difficult because you're going to have to go to the legislature, and you're going to have to get a bill passed that would allow us to look at these state income tax returns. And then number two, if we do this, we're going to find a whole bunch of people who shouldn't be on Medicaid, and everybody's going to get mad at you. They're going to say you're the mean state auditor who doesn't like poor people. And I told her, what I'm hearing from you is this is going to be hard, and they're going to say mean stuff, and those are not good policy reasons to avoid doing this audit. We need to do this. So we do the audit, we get the results that I just told you about, and at the end of it, I went back to the staffer and I said, look, you told me that this is going to be very difficult to do, that we'd have to get the law changed, but we were able to do it. We had good allies in the legislature, we were able to get this done, and we did the audit. But you also told me that people were going to say mean stuff about me, and boy, you hit the nail on the head there. That was 100% on target. ACLU had a big story, put in the Clarion Ledger, Shad White's a big old mean state auditor. And I told her the reason I'm bringing this up is our job is not to worry about what the ACLU says or what any one person says. It is to do our jobs. It is to tell the truth about where taxpayer money is going, to make sure that these programs are functioning according to the law, period. And you and I both know that we weren't doing this to hurt poor people. In fact, we were doing this to make sure that poor people were the only ones who were on the program. There were two individuals later identified living in a 7,000 square foot home in the Jackson metro area, home valued at over $1 million. They had an ownership stake in over 40 gas stations, and they were on Medicaid. And you were paying for their health care. Those are the kinds of people that we were identifying. So I tell you that story to show that sometimes to be able to identify all this waste, you have to be willing to take a few hits, especially in the press. But it is important because so much of our money is going down the drain. And sometimes you have to be willing to make powerful people mad. I'll give you an example of that. K-12 education. I love our public schools. I grew up in our public schools. I went to Mississippi public schools from the time I was in kindergarten to the time I graduated from Ole Miss. My mom as a public school teacher was, for 35 years, 2 of my 4 grandparents were public school teachers. But we have an incredible amount of waste in our public school system that is going to fat cat administrators and not to the teachers and not to the students. It's just not. We've got the highest paid state superintendent of education in the country, but still the lowest paid teachers, even when you adjust for cost of living. We got school superintendents in some of the poorest rural school districts in the state making more money than the governor, but teachers in those same school districts going out of pocket to buy their own classroom supplies. Something about that doesn't make sense. And when you say this stuff out loud, you're going to get some administrators mad at you. You're going to get a group of education activists, that's what they call themselves. You're going to get them mad. But you can't worry about that. We have to point this stuff out. Mississippi spends a greater percentage of its K-12 budget on administration than every other state in the South, with the exception of Washington, D.C. This is a Mississippi problem. And we can do something about this. Texas does something about this. They have a program where they say, okay, in certain school districts, you can't spend any more on administrative costs unless you get approval from the state board or something like that, or they just put a hard cap on it. We could put measures like that into place to fix this problem, but we've got to have leaders who are willing to identify the problem at the outset. And oh, by the way, the other thing that would help with this is if we gave parents more options about where to send their kids to school. If they had more options, we would create competition. Competition breeds efficiency and improvement. Unfortunately, we can't get some of those bills right now through the state legislature, but that is going to change one day. That is going to change one day. Let's talk about our higher education system, wasting our higher education system. Some of y'all have heard me talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Y'all know about this? Words sound nice to some people. DEI are these programs at our public universities that seem like they're just designed to brainwash students, teaching students at seminars about the evils of whiteness, whatever that is. Actual seminars that were taught on that subject at Mississippi State and Ole Miss. Imagine if they had done a seminar on the evils of blackness. I mean, that is incredibly racist. There's no other word for it, incredibly racist. But you and I shell out money to pay for this stuff. Millions of dollars every year go into these DEI initiatives. And not only is it wrong, but it's also incredibly wasteful too. So at my alma mater, Ole Miss, they have 20 DEI staffers, 20. The lead DEI staffer makes more money than the governor and the lieutenant governor combined. And so what do they do with all this money? Our money. What are they doing with these resources? Well, one of their main accomplishments last year, according to them, this is their own documents, is they handed out a grant to study equity-based yoga for preschoolers. I've got 3 kids at home. I could probably teach them yoga if I had to. I don't know what equity-based yoga is, but that's what we're spending money on right now. And other politicians are a little bit queasy about calling this stuff out. Why? Because they don't want to get cut off from their free football tickets at football games. That's it. I love college football. I love going to college football games. But they don't want to jeopardize their relationship with these universities. And so what happens? Your money continues to just go right down the drain on the stuff that makes absolutely no sense at all. North Carolina just did this big study for their universities, looked at their DEI. They cut out their DEI programs. They fired 53 staffers, saved $17 million recurring costs per year, and they're putting that money into campus police to make their universities better. That's common sense stuff. And if we don't start doing stuff like that in Mississippi, states like North Carolina are going to leave us behind. We still send the same amount of money to our universities to educate a gender studies major as we do a mechanical engineer, which makes no sense at all in the world. You're paying for classes in the study of gender and zombies. And if it sounds like I'm making that up, I'm not. That's a real class that you can take. The study of the history of sexuality and hip-hop. That's what you're paying for. North Carolina, again, is doing the exact opposite. They hired Deloitte, a big consulting company, to come in. They're completely reorienting how they spend taxpayer money in North Carolina so that the money goes to the degree programs that actually drive the economy forward, to create the next generation of doctors, nurses, engineers, accountants, the stuff that we need. They are going to have universities that are growth engines for their economy, and we are not unless we are willing to call this stuff out and to fix it. We've got to be willing to do that. These are big ticket items, what I'm talking about. Healthcare, K-12 education, higher education. We spend millions and millions of dollars on this stuff. But we take our study of waste and our audits down to the most granular possible level. So we did a study a couple of years ago. Every single year, you spend about $340,000 of taxpayer money on cell phones for state employees, and the cell phones are never even turned on. Use 0 minutes a month. That's the level of detail that we get down to. You know, I was really encouraged I heard that Elon Musk was planning on trying to start a Department of Government Efficiency if President Trump came back into office, and so I'm very willingly, going to volunteer my time to serve on Elon's committee if he'll have me. But that's the kind of stuff that we need to be doing at the federal government level. And fortunately for us, that's the sort of stuff that I get to do every single day in the auditor's office, is look for government efficiency. Now, you can't change anything from the auditor's office. You can't change policies, but I can shine a light on all this stuff. My team and I can shine a light on all this stuff. And I feel the more that I talk about this and the more we shine a light on waste, the more likely it is that it will change one day. Our estimate is that we've uncovered about $350 million worth of waste in state government recurring every single year. It's a ton of money. It's a ton of money that could be changed with just some policy tweaks. So the next big question then is, what do you do with that money? If you find all this waste, if you're willing to take on the elephant in the room, what do you do with that money? Well, for my part, I think that we ought to start with tax cuts. We ought to start by giving that money back to you so that we can drive our economy forward. Sip of water during your applause. Mississippi is still one of the most taxed states in the South. If you look at the Tax Foundation, they rank states based on how burdensome their state and local governments are on their citizens. We have a higher tax burden in Texas. We have a higher tax burden in Louisiana. We have a higher tax burden in Tennessee, than Alabama, than Georgia, than Florida, than South Carolina. You're starting to get the picture. Our taxes are still too high. And we could have a long debate, I think, about which taxes we cut first. Some say income taxes, some say grocery taxes. But the point to me, the initial and most important point, is that our tax burden is still too high as a state compared to the peer states that we are competing against every single day. So we have to get that in check. What else should we be spending money on? Public safety. We're in Jackson right now. Jackson, tragically, has one of the highest per capita homicide rates of any city, over 100,000 people in the country. And we've been that way for the last 2 or 3 years. We are not going to have a strong, prosperous state until we have a strong, prosperous capital. You cannot have a strong, prosperous capital until you have a safe capital, period. 2 years ago, the chief of police in Jackson estimated that he needed another 100 cops on the street in order to make Jackson safe. So let's get going. The governor right now has done a great job reforming Capitol Police, putting more cops on the street, but we have to redouble those efforts. We have to spend more money on police officers, make our streets safe so that businesses will want to start or stay in Jackson, so that people will want to live, raise a family, go shopping in Jackson. What else? Roads and bridges. I'll tell you a big challenge we face. This may be the biggest one. According to the most recent federal data, 54% of children born in Mississippi are born to unwed mothers. 54%. That is a catastrophic number. And look, if you're born into that environment, you can succeed, but statistically, it's really, really difficult. Kids born into a home without an engaged dad are 20 times more likely to go to prison. They're 9 times less likely to finish high school. They're 5 times more likely to end up in poverty. So when you look in the mirror and you think, why is Mississippi last in all these rankings? It starts right there. It starts right there. And there's stuff that we can do. There are mentorship programs where military veterans get paired with middle school and high school kids. They almost become like another daddy to them, teach them to show up on time, teach them discipline. We can expand those programs, but to find the money to expand those programs, we have to stop paying adult administrators salaries, fat cat salaries, and we have to get money going to the things that actually affect our students, teachers and students. We have to focus on that stuff. If we're willing to do that, if we're willing to do these things, which will be difficult, I think Mississippi has more potential than any other state in the entire country. I grew up here, I was born here, raising a family here, I want to die here. I've lived other places though. I've lived on the East Coast, I've lived in England, Douglas, for a year. Lived in Boston, or outside of Boston, for 3 years. I think of all the places that I've been, all the places I've seen, Mississippi has more potential than any other state in the entire country. We statistically have some of the most generous people, we have the most patriotic people. We're the state of Elvis and B.B. King, of Faulkner, Tennessee Williams. We should be proud of ourselves. But we have to have a government that works well for taxpayers. That's what we have to have. And if we do that, if we have a little bit more common sense about how we spend taxpayer money, I think we can get there. It is going to require changing some things, though. You know, Einstein's definition of insanity, have you heard this? doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, you're going to have to change some things and change some of the people in charge. It just is. And look, I've been accused of a lot of things in my time as state auditor. I have not been accused of being a go-along to get along guy. That hadn't been said yet. That's what it's going to take, is folks who are not go-along to get along people. Folks who are willing to change a few things. And folks who are motivated by the right reasons. I'll tell you what motivates me. Two things. First are my grandfathers. My two grandfathers were my heroes growing up. My mom's dad, both were military veterans. It's what inspired me to join the military. My mom's dad fought in World War II, fought in North Africa. He was hit with a Nazi explosion in the back of his neck, got a Purple Heart, went to a hospital in England, came home. That was his war. Many, many years later, when I was a little boy, he had a stroke and he could not speak. But every time I went over to his house, he would sit down beside me and he would take my hand and he would put it on the back of his neck so that I could feel the scar where that shrapnel went in. And he would walk me over to his desk drawer and he would pull out his desk drawer and show me his Purple Heart, which I now have in my house and I'm going to give to my son one day. I don't know what he was thinking, but I have a guess, and my guess is that he was trying to say, service to your country is important, young man. Service to your community is important. And so every single day I wake up thinking, what am I doing to make my country and my community better? My other inspiration is my kids. So we have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. So this is the quietest room I've ever been in, at least in months. This is my vacation, actually, right now, at this moment. I love my kids. They're great. They're rambunctious, healthy, and happy. Every morning when I look at them, I think, what am I doing to make Mississippi better for them? I want them to stay here. I want them to be able to get a good job here. I want them to raise their families here and have my grandbabies here. What am I doing to make Mississippi better for them every single day? That's the question that I face. It's what makes me grateful to be able to be in this job for you. Let me leave you with this thought. It's a little bit nerdy, so you have to bear with me. I really enjoy the history of economic development and industrial development. That's what I studied when I was in England. And I'll tell you this, I think that we are at a very critical moment as a state, right now, this moment. If you look back at the history of industrial development in America, industrial development started in the United States in New York and Boston with textiles and ship manufacturing, and then it flowed to places that were cheaper, where land was cheaper and labor was cheaper, the Rust Belt, making cars, steel, flowed south after that to Virginia, North Carolina, and now we look up now, where are the big industrial facilities in America, car manufacturing plants, data centers, where are those being built in the United States? Here, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama. That wave of development is a wave. It comes and goes. The same time that Amazon announced their new big data center out here in Madison County, which is incredible, they also announced one being built in Mexico. That's where the wave is headed next. So we have this moment right now. We have this moment over the course of the next 2 decades where we are either going to figure out how to make our government lean, we're going to figure out how to get money into the hands of teachers and into our classrooms to improve our school system, to cut taxes on our people so that we can drive our economy forward, or we're not. If we do that, we're going to end up like states like North Carolina that has a huge research hub. They've done well. And if we don't, if we do the same old thing that we've always done, if we have a sclerotic, broken K-12 system and we don't address it, if we don't cut taxes, we're going to end up as a state like the worst bombed out Rust Belt towns that you see on TV. That's the choice we face today, right now. Right now. That's why this moment is so critical. So I'm going to close by asking you for a favor. Every day I pray Solomon's prayer for wisdom. I would ask that you pray that for our elected officials. Pray for wisdom for our elected officials, because we're in a period that is consequential. It's important. There's a lot at stake. And I think the future of our state for the next 2 or 3 decades hinges on what we do right now. Thank y'all for having me. It's an honor.
I'd love to hear some questions. I'm just going to sit back down and back over to you, Shad. Keep going.
Questions about life, love, Ole Miss football. Lots of opinions. Yes, sir.
You seldom think public officials have private issues. We always say that their offices will be brought out in a personal situation. That I've had experience where you have a legal entity attempting to serve you. What I would call a manner is not good. In your office, you should be served with the court members. If you would, elaborate a little bit about what happened.
Yeah, so last few years have been interesting dealing with this welfare case, and sometimes it's difficult both on me and family too. So there was one instance, and this is in the book when you get a chance to read it, but there's one instance where I was at work one day. This is like 9 or 10 days after our youngest child was born, and I was in my office, and Rena, my wife, was at home with the baby, and someone came to our house and knocked on the door and refused to identify themselves. And when she asked them, "Who are you?" and that person just said, "Well, I need to see Shad." And she said, "Should I call the police?" And he said, "Yeah, go ahead and call the police." And so she went and called the police, and then ultimately we realized that person walked away and vanished. Ultimately we realized that person worked for Mr. Favre, Brett Favre. And so that's the kind of stuff that you deal with in public life, unfortunately. But look, I don't mean to tell that story to complain. I knew what I was getting myself into when I took a job like this. Again, going back to my dad, my dad was a small town elected official and an oil field pumper. I saw some people, who would yell at him on the street for how high their water bill was in a little town in front of me. So, as a little boy. So I knew what being an elected official was about. I count it as an honor to be able to be in a job like this, regardless of the licks that you sometimes have to take, because I get to wake up with a sense of purpose that I'm doing something for y'all. So I'm willing to take a few hits. It's not the worst thing in the world. Yes, ma'am.
Shad, doesn't our welfare system pay people not to be married? I know on interrelated, they lose benefits. That is causing a lot of that single parent.
The question for those of you who couldn't hear it was, does our welfare system pay people to not be married? The short answer is yes, there are multiple programs throughout the government that have what is called a marriage penalty baked in there. That's something as a policy matter that both state and federal government needs to fix. And what we know is that stable marriages are the most important institution for creating wealth and prosperity and successful citizens in the long run. So the fact that we have government policies that make that harder is wrong and immoral. I would say this, one of the challenges is very few people are willing to stand up and say marriage is important. It's important for a child to be raised in a loving two-parent home. But it's just the truth. So if you look at some of the research from a guy named Raj Chetty, who's a researcher at Harvard, probably the most famous social science researcher in the country, he'll show you that a stable two-parent home is the thing that correlates most strongly with a kid's chance for success later on. Much more strongly than a good school or really anything else. It's a stable two-parent home. Yes, sir.
How would you fix that misaligned welfare program that on a state basis that do incentivize people to not be married?
Here's kind of where I'll start with where we are as I'll repeat too. How would you fix it, basically? How would you fix that marriage penalty? Let's start with where we are and how we're currently spending welfare money in Mississippi. So we get a bunch of TANF money from the federal government every single year. It goes to the Department of Human Services. And right now, a small percentage of that goes out in the form of checks to people. So that's what we typically think of when we think of welfare. The vast majority of those funds for the last year or so have been set aside, and we as a state are actually just not spending it. So we're accumulating a massive surplus of welfare funds right now. The last time I looked, it was north of $90 million. So the question is, what do we do with that $90 million that does not create a marriage penalty? So one thing that I have proposed is, if we're going to get that money and we're going to spend it in a way that makes some difference, we should only give it to people who work, period. So maybe a tax cut for folks who go from being unemployed to being employed. And when we do that, it's called an earned income tax credit. When we do that, we should ensure that if a person gets married and increases their income, increases their household income, that they're not penalized, that payment doesn't go down because that person's married. That's the short version of how you fix that. But again, we've got to get that policy into place. Otherwise, this surplus of funds is just going to keep growing over time. Yeah.
Shad, you mentioned about the DEI topic. You mentioned about the 20 people that are in the DEI program in our state universities or whatever. A lot of companies get backed up from it, but the fact that the spotlight's been put on, a lot of the companies are backed up. What I'm hearing on the university level, though, is it's the same people with a new title to the program, just a rebrand. Are you seeing that?
Yes. So you may have noticed last month, Ole Miss in particular changed the name of their DEI office to something else, and I didn't even bother to memorize it. Access, Opportunity, and Unicorns, whatever it is. All the three major universities now have changed the name of their DEI offices, and my sense, based on what I've heard from the universities, is that nothing has actually changed. The same people who work for the DEI office at Ole Miss now just work for this new office. The same director is now the new director. Again, that is very different from a state like North Carolina, where they just cut $17 million out of the budget for DEI. In fact, there was a staffer at the University of Southern Mississippi who told Mississippi Today the quiet part out loud, and she said, "Oh, we just changed the name of the office. We're not doing anything different." That shows you the deep level of commitment that these folks have to this idea. This is basically their religion, and they're not going to give it up quietly, and they're not going to give it up easily. The question for us is, are we comfortable paying for their religion? And I'm not. I'm not comfortable raising my kids to believe that they should treat everybody the same way, regardless of the color of their skin, and then have them go to a Mississippi public university and be brainwashed to believe the exact opposite. And I definitely don't want to be the guy paying the taxes to finance the brainwashing. So we've got to fix this. We've got to fix it.
Mr. White, I'd like to appreciate you for your moral and ethical stand. You've been the focus of many prayer groups who pray for you. And we appreciate the fiscal responsibility and accountability that you've demonstrated. We have a great deal of faith in your capacity. Thank you.
Thank you.
What I have not heard you discuss today is any dealings that your office has with small businesses and the struggle that small businesses have in Mississippi alone in regard to all the tax matters that affects. But I do have a question about the situations when either rogue auditors or auditors who are sent in, perhaps like a local different, who go in and harness and pull a livelihood out of a small business owner's capacity to produce. It is counterintuitive, and it locks those small businesses under a death spiral.
Yep.
There are these cases that are in your office right now.
Yep.
Yes, sir. I know one person.
We don't audit small businesses.
Okay, so can you help me understand this and where to go with that?
Yep. So just to clarify about my office, we only audit government agencies.
Got it.
School districts, county governments, state agencies, only government money. If you're being audited by somebody from the government, that's coming from the Department of Revenue. So I don't know anything about that. Don't do anything with that. But look, and that's why I didn't address small businesses, because that's not what my office does at all. Only audit government entities. What I would say about just the plight of small businesses in general is I completely agree with you, and I've seen it firsthand. My dad and my grandfather had their own little baby LLC my entire life when they were pumping oil, and they still do. My dad still has it. It's tough. I mean, I grew up in high school and I was the one typing invoices for my dad, just trying to make the small business work. It is often a family affair. My wife ran a small business in Pearl, Mississippi for 2 years, And it's tough dealing with the government, dealing with regulators, dealing with compliance folks who come by incessantly. It's tough. All of that is very, very difficult. When I worked at the Mississippi Justice Institute, we would sue the government on behalf of small businesses if we felt that they were unfairly enforcing regulations. So I completely agree with you. I think that is a really key, important thing that we ought to be talking about in the state that I didn't address when I was talking earlier. The reason it's so important is that we love paying attention to big companies, right? And when they come here, they move a facility here, our headquarters, and the big ribbon cutting and all that. But the vast majority of jobs in our state that are in the private sector are in small businesses. And so we have to be constantly thinking about whether we're placing a burden on small businesses. Totally agree. Yes, sir, Bill.
Yeah, the state auditor does not, you have authority to audit cities, municipalities, things like that. Would there be any legislation, or do you think there's something that the state can do to change that? I know they have accounting firms and others that audit cities, and the city of Jackson is probably a good case study. It's not very effective.
Yeah.
A lot of ways, fraud and abuse.
It's a great point. So for whatever reason, there's a part of the state code that says we're not allowed to audit cities. So we can audit counties, school districts, basically any other government entity, but we can't audit cities. There was a bill this past year that would have allowed my office to audit some cities. I think it was, at one point the bill was styled to say, the cities above a certain size or under certain circumstances. The bill died. Any bill like that always dies for whatever reason. They're hesitant to give me any more responsibility for whatever reason. The good news is cities do get audited. So cities above a certain size, like Jackson, they get audited by a private CPA firm. What I've noticed is that the audits come back and they show what you would expect, which is a city like Jackson is horribly mismanaged, and the money is not going to places that are productive, or water bills aren't being collected, or whatever it may be. That was the story for a long time in Jackson before this most recent takeover of the water system. So anyway, what I would say is cities do get audited. It's worth reading your city's audit to see what's going on. But ultimately, a city is not going to change until we change the elected officials who are making the decisions, right? An audit is not a cure. An audit is an autopsy. An audit is telling you what happened to the dead body after it's dead. If you want to fix something, we have to elect better people, period. That's it. That is the feature of democracy, of a republic, I guess. Yes, sir. 1 minute? No? Just fire away. Go ahead.
Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana, all three of our neighboring states now have proper school choice. That means that every family in those states can take between $8,000 and $9,000 every year and allocate it to a school of their choice. Would you support something like that in Mississippi, and how can we make that happen?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's important to support something like that. I actually had a conversation with a guy who owns a small business in Bay Springs, Mississippi yesterday. We were on the phone, and just kind of out of the blue, he said, "What do you think about school choice, about giving parents more options?" And I told him what I believe, that we need to give parents more options, that we need to give parents the ability to take their tax dollars to the school of their choice. And he said, well, he said, I've come around on this. I used to think differently, but now I believe that, if we had more options down here in a rural part of the state, that parents would feel better about whether they're sending their kids to school, and they would feel better about where their taxpayer dollars are going because they're making a choice with that. And I pointed out to him, I said, you need to keep telling folks that, especially where you're from, because we get choices about where we spend our taxpayer dollars in other programs. You can take a Pell Grant to the university of your choice. You can take a GI Bill to the university of your choice. If you get Medicaid, you can take that to many doctors of your choice. Housing vouchers, child care vouchers, you can take that to the provider of your choice. Why do we lock kids into a K-12 school system? Why does that make any sense? So these are really important formative years of a kid's life. Why are we trapping some of these kids in some of our worst schools, especially in F-rated school districts? So I think it's important. I think we need to do it. I think it's not going to happen in the near future. I think it's just not going to happen. I think that those kinds of bills, just like the bills to kill funding for DEI, they always go to the same place and they always die. And that's just where we are right now. Yes, sir.
Shad, one quick question. Based upon your audits around the state, which agency have you found to be the most efficient, and what do you attribute that to?
Efficient? Efficient. Yeah. Mine. good state agency. I think the state agencies that are doing well are focused on recruiting and keeping talented people all the way down at the middle manager level. I guess maybe to give one small example, I think the progress that Capitol Police have made as a state agency is very, very impressive in the last couple of years. So when I first came into office in 2018, Capitol Police was a very quiet little agency inside DPS. They didn't do a lot of on-the-street policing. It was mainly sort of like security guards for buildings downtown, government buildings. And there was an effort to reform that. So they brought in a new head of Capitol Police. They recruited new officers, talented investigators, changed the color of the cars. I mean, they did symbolic things and they did real things. And now the Capitol zone is much safer than it was when I first started. So that's an example of progress that can be made in government. It just takes good leadership at the top. It takes getting good people in there and being smart about how you spend your money. Yes, sir.
I might make an observation, might have some comments on it. So much of this verbiage we hear, this culture focus things, think diversity, equity, inclusion, race, colonialism, and on and on and on. One thing that frustrates me is the conservative replies oftentimes oblivious to the fact that these terms oftentimes just gibberish, smoke screens that are thrown up by these people. And I remember the sociologist Peter Berger, long since deceased, made a comment about needing to deconstruct deconstructors, examine their terms. Terms, they have this dichotomy now of race. Now it's almost white versus people of color, which is kind of a created construct in which almost everybody in the world falls into the people of color, and then this white group is this small little group that they can then bully about. And I'd just like to see more opposition to this. One last example is universities. Colonialism is a big focus among the left. We're looking at colonialism or neo-colonialism or something like that. Have you ever thought about the university institution creates these little enclaves, we might call them cantonments, for people from outside to come in who then lord over the locals who have no ability to respond to this left-wing gibberish that they spout. And I come from a background of conservative, but also come from anthropology, geography, history, and such as that. So I look at, analyze these terms. Most of this stuff they just spout out every day is just sheer nonsense.
It's a great point. If you haven't had the chance to read the book called America's Cultural Revolution by Christopher Rufo, you should read it. I recommend it. It basically charts the development of all of this DEI stuff and this language that we're talking about. And many, many years ago, back there in the 60s, the left in America was much more militant. If you remember the Weather Underground and bombs on college campuses and that sort of thing. And once it became clear that America was not going to accept their views if they took those tactics, they changed their mind and they said, what we need to do is what they call a slow march through the institutions. And what that meant to them was take over the universities first, where we can all go get jobs as professors, and then we take over the federal government, and then we take over corporations and our K-12 school system, and we impose this language and these beliefs on the people that are in each of these systems. And so that's what they've done, starting with the universities. And if we're going to fix this, we're going to have to also start to unwind this at the universities, to challenge them on their terms. This is basically just a giant mask for Marxism. And that's what they said back in the day, that this is a Marxist set of ideology, or Marxist ideology, and it's being masked and sold as, well, we have to achieve some sort of racial equity. And the more people they get on board with that idea, the more that they can convince folks, well, and the end solution is obviously Marxism. So we have to combat this. This is important to our everyday lives. Universities in other states are huge economic drivers. They are producing the next generation of workers, doctors, nurses, accountants, engineers, the people that will move the economy forward. We can either have universities that do that or that do this other thing that we were just talking about. Other states are figuring this out and they're getting it right. Look at Florida, look at North Carolina, look at Texas. We have to get it right. Those states are going to leave us behind. They just are. Good?
I think we have time for one last question.
Yes, sir.
My family and I moved down to Mississippi from Queens, New York about 2.5 years ago. The city itself was going crazy, as you may know from the news. But that wasn't the ultimate reason we moved. I decided my vote doesn't count there. It's a one-party state, and they make it that way. And so we did the only thing we could, we voted with our feet and got out. You mentioned voting, yay. I worry a lot about integrity of the voting. It may not be part of your office, so you may not have spoken about it, but I just wanted to say, my gosh. I am not going to Mexico or South America. This is the end of the road. And I'm here to fight and make sure our vote still counts.
Come on.
So we can vote them out if we need to.
Totally. Great point. Reason I didn't really address it is that's outside of elections or outside of the purview of my office. But in the more general talk that I gave, yeah, 100%. I mean, for my money, I would prefer to go back to paper ballots the day of.
Yes.
That's what I think we ought to do.
Yes.
I think that this ought to be, election day ought to be an important moment in the life of a citizen, and you ought to dedicate time and you ought to go vote. That's critical. And look, we have to make exceptions for our military veterans. There was a period in the last, not saying military veterans, service members. There was a period last year where I thought I might be deployed with the National Guard when election day was happening. You've got to have absentee ballot voting, so you've got to have provisions for that. But I think as many people as possible and as many rules should be put into place as possible to focus on voting on one day on paper ballots, period.
Yes.
Thank you all for having me tonight.